Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Really, really pleased to be welcoming you here to another City Talk. It's a bit of a gray day here in Toronto. It's getting cold, winter's coming. So we're all going to have to hunker down and figure out how we actually make our way through, in Ontario's case, or parts of Ontario, another lockdown. I know the same is true in British Columbia. There are parts of Alberta that are locking down. I know that the Atlantic bubble is altering as well. So we're all in this together, as we say. Not everyone's having the same experience, but we are collectively trying to navigate what the new normal is going to be over the next several months. And also, what are the longer term implications of what COVID has exposed for us? What we now see as things that absolutely can't go untended, can no longer just fester, but have to be addressed. And could there be a more important topic than housing? I don't think so. So we're really very pleased to be working with the Housing Research Collaborative. And they're a fabulous model, I think, of what you can accomplish when you hunker down, focus on specific questions and challenges, and then get the best and brightest and smartest people with lived experience, people in the policy fields, and people in academia to work together to kind of come up with tangible things. I feel at CUI that we are witnessing this shift. As you know, we're supporting a group called The Shift, but we're witnessing this large shift of us moving from problem identification to really honing in on solutions. And I'm appreciative that under Penny's leadership, you've come to join us today and that the City Talk audience is coming in. I want to remind people that we videotape these sessions and then they will be posted in a couple of days. And then we encourage all of you to share the video recording with your colleagues. I'm always astonished at the numbers of people that actually watch these things late at night, or maybe they watch them first thing in the morning when they have time, or maybe they have it on in the midst of while they're doing something else. So we're really building a repository, an archive of useful, practical experience and knowledge. And I can really assure you that you will look back on this. We will all look back on this and try to remember pivotal moments. I learned this the hard way when I was in New Orleans after Katrina for that 6 years during that rebuilding. And we realized we had to go back and see, what were we thinking in 2006? What were we thinking in 2007 to understand how change happens and how we evolve? The Canadian Urban Institute is in the connective tissue business. We have people working across the country. We have hundreds of volunteers engaged in our platforms. Thank you to all of you. Today in Toronto, as I suggested, Coles, it's the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many, many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And across Turtle Island, we're covered by Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and with the various treaties, the Williams Treaty, also signed by various Anishinaabeg nations. In addition, this morning, as you can see, we have a panel drawn from across the country and actually in Europe. So I'm going to just add in there, I hope I have it, I do, that Penny and Andrés are coming to us from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I've heard it many times, I should be able to say it, the Tsleil-Waututh nations. You folks can correct me. Carolyn's coming in from Ottawa, which is an Algonquin unceded territory with the Anishinaabe. And Julie, am I right? Yes, Julie is coming in. I'm going to take a stab at this with the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. How was that, Julie? Was I close?
That's very close. Thank you.
Close. And pays her respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, who are the traditional custodians on the land in which RMIT is located. You'll hear more about RMIT when Lucy's speaking. So thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to step off now. It's over to you, Dr. Gurstein, to lead this conversation. Really, as I said, very, very pleased that you're with us. And it's important that the City Talk community learn and contribute and struggle with you as you come to solutions finding in this process. Tomorrow, we'll be on City Talk again, talking about what is the future of the urban university. And everybody appreciates universities are extraordinarily challenged, but they are also city builders located in urban environments. And so we'll have the presidents from MacEwan, U of T, University of Toronto, and Ryerson with us to talk about this really important topic. So that's tomorrow. Over to you, Penny. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to step out and listen with great interest as you talk to us about how this moment could potentially be the seminal one for the future of housing and housing mix in Canada. So thanks, I'll step out.
Well, thank you, Mary. I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn Whitzman to start off.
Thanks, Mary. And the question, the very practical question we have today is, how can COVID-19 push governments to provide adequate housing? I'm Carolyn Whitzman. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, and I've been working with Penny and Andrés and Julie and many others on this policy scan. And why am I not moving forward? Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated the global housing emergency. Although governments around the world have told people to shelter in place, many can't shelter in place. About 1.6 billion people, or a third of the urban population, have insecure tenure or are overcrowded or have lack of access to water and sanitation. We know that all of that are risk factors. There's been an economic shutdown around the world, especially with people in service and tourism related industries. And about half of Canadian renters have less than a month's savings. And that has led to evictions and foreclosures and the threat of evictions and foreclosures in many parts of the world. There's evidence of increased racial and income-based inequalities in COVID-13 rates, and certainly increased global violence against women. So with that as our context, a group of us got together in August to find out whether there are any signs that there is rapid policy making done well in response, as two researchers in Australia asked. The Housing Research Collaborative at UBC was funded by the Peter Wall Institute, and we started off by searching for academic and policy and media reports using COVID-19 and housing policy. But we also had 3 roundtables. I'm not going to bother to read all those names. Those slides will be available afterwards. But as you can see, we met with activists and experts, researchers across Canada. We met with researchers in Asia, Australia, South America, Europe, and Africa. And they provided us with all kinds of links to policies and also ways for us to frame those policies. So we started to develop an analytic framework based on work done by the SHIFT, and Mary's already mentioned that the SHIFT, which has been started up by Leilani Farah, the former UN Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, is housed right now at the Canadian Urban Institute, and also a really good article from many different researchers from different countries on the Global South. So 3 priorities: dampen the spread of COVID-19 based on the latest available science, improving the likelihood of health outcomes for those who are most marginalized, and then improving long-term conditions for those who are most marginalized by generating adequate housing. So in terms of dampening the spread, the most immediate and short-term actions, there has been a lot of work on protection for those living in informal settlements. In Canada, we've been calling them encampments, getting adequate water, sanitation, distancing, including responding to the express needs of residents. But in some cases, promises have not been delivered. There has been protection for those living in shelters and other congregate housing, that is housing with shared toilets and cooking facilities. And again, sometimes that has been promised, but it has been delivered in a short-term fashion and not over the entire length of COVID. And of course, we're very much in a COVID era right now. And in some cases, community groups have supported self-help measures and have provided community resistance to evictions. And this is true in countries of the global north and the global south. In terms of improving health outcomes of marginalized communities, there have been particularly short-term eviction moratoria and short-term help with utility cutoffs. But again, the question is, how long is it going to last? Is it going to last for the entire period of the economic slowdown? There's been financial assistance to renters and mortgage holders with reduced income, such as the CERB in Canada, and additional help from BC Housing. And there have been some measures to access justice for housing abuses, including inadequate distancing when it was promised, stealth evictions, independent monitoring of promised government policy for adherence to targets, but I have to say that the access to justice measures have been the hardest to find. Finally, there's a set of moving towards a solution, as Mary said, building back better. So we were searching for examples of better COVID. Perhaps it would have happened without COVID. That's hard to say. We just used the timeline of the start of March of 2020. There has been, especially in Canada, acquiring properties and lands for social and rent-regulated affordable housing, such as the Rapid Housing Initiative. There are examples of protecting land and housing from predatory financialization. And if you look at the database, you'll see an example from California. And finally, and perhaps most ambitiously, new or improved strategies, increased targets, new funding, programs for new social and affordable housing, including renovations, a recent example, for example, from Melbourne, Australia. So we ended up, and we had lots of discussions in the roundtable, we're not going to call them best practices, we're going to call them promising or good practices. All of them need a little bit of oversight. There's been temporary distancing. There's been public education and health services to housing that doesn't have access to those things. So all government should be listening to the expressed needs of homeless people and those in inadequate housing and act immediately to improve their health and safety. There has been a certain amount of homelessness prevention, but probably not enough. There were 20 million Americans left homeless by the global financial crisis. How are we going to, in the long term, combine rent and income assistance, rent freezes, perhaps guaranteed minimum income, eviction bans, acquiring houses? This is still a work in progress. And how are we going to rapidly secure new low-cost homes? Before COVID, there was an activist group in California called Moms for Housing, who basically squatted in an abandoned property. And there's a bill that now bars sellers of foreclosed homes from bundling them in auction for sale to a single buyer, because we know that real estate investment trusts have been a great enemy of keeping housing affordable. The city of Barcelona has ordered property groups to let out vacant flats used for short-term rental, or it will expropriate the properties. So these are examples of good practice that hopefully will be the start of addressing inequalities that were both exposed and exacerbated by COVID. There are many scary examples, and certainly COVID-19 is coinciding with climate change related disasters to leave hundreds of millions without homes this year globally. But there are signs of hope. There's the Right to Home, which is 11 Canadian cities that are working together and have pledged to build back better. And basically, I'll end with the message of the report in the database, which is all levels of government have to reassess their housing policies and recommit to investing to end homelessness and inadequate housing. I'll end there, and I will hand over to Andrés to show you the database.
Thank you, Carolyn. So we developed this database to be able to show people everything that we've collected during these roundtables. And we asked ourselves, what's the best way to present this in a friendly way, not in a normal Google sheet. So we developed this visualization using Tableau, which is a tool that I guess many of you know, but for those who don't know, it's a free online tool that allows us to create data visualizations and graphics out of existing databases, which can be either local on your computer or can be hosted in the cloud, which is, in our case, it's basically on a spreadsheet in Google. So we created this visualization to be able to keep it up to date and updated in the long term. In the landing page, we have a very simple overview of the different distribution of the policies as we have it in our database and different policies that we gathered using different categories that Carolyn just mentioned, and the different distributions, either time frame or level of government that have implemented these policies. And if you go into the map, for instance, you can get a glimpse of the different policies that have been implemented in the different locations and cities across the world. This will be in the next couple of months. You'll see that this map will probably get a little bit fuller, and the list will increase for each city. That's pretty much it. Once you click, one of the advantages with Tableau is that it allows you to filter through the different categories, for instance, or the different graphics. You can interact and filter across them. So let's say we click on this category, self-help protect measures, and you get the different distributions changing in the rest of the graphics. So moving forward, we have the policy database. It's in a different sheet all the way on the top. This is a more text-heavy sort of page, and what it allows you to is just to search and browse across the different databases that with different policies that we've collected, and it allows you to filter through the different alternatives that we have for them. So it's very useful for pretty much searching around and getting a bit more information on the different policies. If you see, once you hover your mouse over the different policies, you get sort of a quick facts like the leading institution, level of government, time frame and location, and the target groups for each, well, at least for the information that is available in the literature. And if you click one of the policies, you get a brief description and a short assessment of whether is it working or not, depending on what the literature has told us. And if you click on the reference, you can go to the main reference from where we've collected for the most of the information. So once you're done, you can just quickly click on the policy and move forward and keep searching. We wanted this to be as friendly and easy to use as possible for most people, so you don't have to deal with an annoying Google sheet. And this will keep improving and getting more robust, this database. So that's pretty much it. This is hosted in the Housing Research Collaborative webpage under initiatives. And yeah, and you can access the full report that Carolyn helped write. That's pretty much it. So now we're moving to Julie Lawson.
Thanks, Andrés. That looks very user-friendly now. Alrighty. Okay. My focus is very much on what's happening in Europe, and I hope that's of interest and inspiring for you. And the question is largely, has there been a sort of a redirection in focus because of COVID that's happening in the pace and the direction of housing reform? So it takes a little while to get that going. But as you've probably been well aware, the impact of COVID in terms of the number of cases and the number of deaths has been really, really enormous in Europe, with over 16 million cases that have been of infections, but almost 370,000 deaths. Where I am at the moment, which is the Netherlands, it's almost 9,000. And we're in lockdown and look like being that way for quite some time. But the important thing is that there are real variations in how it's hit the housing system.
And I'll just jump back in, Penny. Sometimes this happens where someone freezes. So if Julie can hear us, she should sign out and sign back in, because I think she's frozen. It looks like everybody else is still live. I can see Andrés moving. Yep, I think she's probably there. She's probably signed back in. I'll step back
in. I'm come back in. Hello, everything's going okay?
So far.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know why it clicked out. But I'll just move through quickly the context for which COVID hit. So strong focus on home ownership going on for the last 10, 20 years. We've been relying on rising house prices more and more to fuel our own economic growth. But of course, it has been a very uneven process, over indebtedness. It's been pro-cyclical. Perhaps it's made our economies more unstable. We've also seen the rise of asset manager capitalism, the importance of large global corporate landlords, which have been, just like in the United States, undergoing opportunistic purchase of large portfolios, often former social housing or distressed mortgage default properties. And we've seen, of course, as wage growth has been well surpassed by housing costs, there's been increased reliance on the private rental sector, which across Europe offers very varying protection. In looking to what governments have been doing in this area, we've really come to the end of the line with monetary policies that just try to influence the flow of investment. It's been far too blunt. Much of it being mobilised and flowing into real estate investments, which has been accelerated into particular forms and through tax settings and through the regulation and non-regulation of the lenders. We've also had constraints of what governments can do in Europe. So we have something called the Stability and Growth Pact, which limits how much in debt, the size of their budgets relative to their capacity and so on. We've also had definitions on what governments can do in terms of delivering services, and of course, very powerful emphasis on competition policy. And this stance has given social and public housing a fairly hard time. There's been many privatisations also, and it's narrowed many social housing systems' focus, like in the Netherlands, for example, or in Sweden, to be more narrowly targeted. So the public purpose has been shifted often to one which is more of a welfare purpose. Hopefully I won't get kicked out. So in the context of this pandemic, there's been a thought that we need to do differently than how we responded to the last financial crisis. The last financial crisis saw much more an emphasis on bailing out the banks and increasing liquidity. This time, we're looking at much more emphasis on purposeful investment. Which direction should it go? What will its impact be? How will it stimulate more sustainable growth and create jobs, bring about environmental benefits? And the advice has been coming from the OECD to build back better. And you'll see also the UN Habitat saying, keep in mind, keep front and centre those sustainable development goals. For example, SDG 11, affordable and inclusive housing. And you're also seeing in the Green Deal much more emphasis on it being a just and green deal. Social inclusion needs to be part of it. There is no transition if it's not going to be a fair transition, says Frans Timmermans only today. There's a new leadership. There's some faces of the new commission. There's a pillar of social rights now since 2017, which has given more focus on quality of living including housing affordability. You have a new leadership team. I've circled one member of the leadership team, that's Frans Timmermans, and he's the author of the Great Green Deal, and we'll be hearing about its impact. You also see finance ministers saying, okay, let's be more flexible with our Stability and Growth Pact. Let's allow governments to cater for unusual events. Let's give them the chance to make it temporary schemes, to set up grants, to give subsidised guarantees and bank loans. Let's enable more public purpose investments. So that's new. And that's different, and that could potentially drive more sustainable housing system reform as well, if allowed. So there's been, as I said, varying impact of European housing systems. Some have done well, and some there may be more reforms, and some may lead to a reassessment of the way things are. So I'm going to talk about Finland, Denmark, a bit about Austria briefly, Germany, and also some light on the end of the tunnel in Australia as well. So Finland, I would consider to be the best in class. It had the most rapid, effective, quick response. It started off well. It has the lowest level of overcrowding. It doesn't have such a big problem with unaffordable housing or those being at risk of poverty, which are the indicators in the social pillar, if you like. It got in early with stimulating the economy. It sees no need for future austerity. Very rapid automatic stabilisers or shock absorbers, unemployment benefits, housing assistance, other forms of social security. It postponed evictions if necessary. It postponed mortgage payments if necessary, and a whole range of other things. But importantly, it had a strong social housing system which it could just breathe out and expand by adding 30% more new public loans and also interest rate subsidies. So this is how Finland's housing is pulled together with all the different land instruments, long-term low-cost financing via its publicly owned municipal finance corporation, grants and guarantees, and now interest subsidies coming in, expanded from its central agency, ARA. It's very important. It has very good limited profit housing legislation and the regulation of that, with rents varying by portfolio costs and so on, and rent assistance if required across the country. Austria, simply the similar model, but already very accomplished in terms of its energy efficiencies and its quality of housing. It's also been able to just breathe out and build more on an existing well-functioning system. The French social landlords have accelerated their switch towards low emission energy efficient housing. They propose a 3-year plan expanding production and rehabilitation of more than 300,000 units and improving 400,000, huge numbers in France again, as it was after the GFC. Importantly, they're proposing a new alliance of public purpose banks. So you've got the Caisse de Dépôt, which is their big bank, and you've got other banks coming in, the European Investment Bank and the Council of Europe Bank, forming an alliance together to ensure that the renovation of these new dwellings doesn't make them unaffordable, that no one's left behind. Denmark, it has its own, if you like, internal reserves, and those reserves, the National Housing Fund, they are built up over time. I'll just show you a little diagram about that soon. But the government has said, okay, folks, from that fund, we need to spend that now because we need to stimulate jobs and also address green issues early. So they had the money from their revolving fund to put towards purposeful counter-cyclical effort. This is a little diagram of the way it works. Basically, any additional contributions of rent that are made after financing is paid off feel like that period when the amortization of those long loans is paid off, those deposits have to go into a national building fund. The building fund accumulates these savings, and at certain times it is able to make investments in renovations and improvements. That fund has been used now to put $4 billion into making these enormous number of renovations. You see, Germany, different model. As you're all aware, over the last few decades, the national government there has stopped playing as a capital investment role in social housing programs. It devolved that responsibility down to their Länder or their provincial governments. But of course, some had the capacity to do that and others didn't. So you saw some states like North Rhine-Westphalia continuing to build, whereas you had others. So it was very uneven. What's happened now is that the national government has come back in. It's put $4.9 billion towards boosting social housing again after 40 years of absence. So you see that new leadership role being played by the national government in direct capital investment. But you also have another struggle going on in terms of rent regulation, particularly of those dwellings from the global corporate landlords who had purchased in bulk many of those municipal dwellings that were privatized in the past early 2000. So you see a really interesting fight going on in Berlin, which has capped rents, and you see that being allowed by the courts. And now you see Vonovia and Deutsche Wohnen trying to challenge that again. And now there's a referendum coming back as a countermeasure with the residents of Berlin calling for a referendum. They have 57,000 signatures to have that referendum to expropriate the properties. Only yesterday in the news, the second phase of rent capping has come in, where if you're over charging your rents, you must reduce the rents and you can be fined as well. So that's been upheld in the courts, and so it's certainly something to watch. Looking ahead, I mentioned I was involved in Housing 2030. That's a toolkit for policymakers on land for inclusive and affordable housing, financing structures for the same, governance and leadership for the same, environmental standards that also ensure affordability. That will be having podcasts all along the way through the next one is in February and also April. We've got the renovation wave, which is a massive initiative of the European Commission. You can hear Frans Timmermans talk passionately about the fairness of that renovation wave. He's the European Commission's Vice President. There's a little link there to his film if you want to hear that. He delivered that today. And also there's going to be an affordable housing initiative for the first time at that European level to pilot 100 renovation districts. So that's a very interesting neighbourhood approach involving cross-sectoral partnerships. So a real change in direction. So business as usual, I would say not, and that the EU Green Deal is potentially a major game changer. Australia also perhaps has done it all on its own. Not Australia as a nation, but as a state of Victoria. It's showing a lot of leadership and responsibility, announcing this month a whole range of measures, strengthening tenancy rights. They were already weak. Now they're much better and stronger, improving dwelling standards for private renters, targeting rent relief, addressing the backlog in social housing, and especially in repairs and renovation, and making strategic investment. It's a major direct investment by the government. It will be issuing bonds. It will be using its own growth fund, and it will be looking for low-cost, long-term finance, 5.3 billion Australian dollars to go towards around 12,000 dwellings, of which there are dwellings for people with disabilities, people who've suffered domestic violence, and also affordable housing general stock, and many more renovated stock. So to conclude, there's a pre-COVID housing investment at regulatory setting that's ripe for a reset to address affordability and security issues. COVID shows why. And the focus, though, in Europe is very much on green renovation, energy efficiency, and fairness. Finland provides some valuable lessons in being effective and counter-cyclical, as does Austria. There are all sorts of interesting ideas there. The reforms of weaker systems are also possible, and Victoria shows the way and provides some inspiration. We should all be watching what's happening in Berlin. And I hope that you can join me in being involved in the benefits, if you like, of the Green Deal and the renovation wave, and hopefully the Affordable Housing Initiative, because these are all mechanisms for real reform, both socially and environmentally as well. So thank you.
So thank you, Julie. So as you can tell, I mean, what is obvious is that this is, we're not in business as usual. The various governments that the various initiatives that we've identified by governments have shown real sort of leadership in addressing the sort of critical needs that we're trying that have been going on for decades now. So this is a moment, and I really hope that you can be using this database to actually strengthen what is possible in your own jurisdiction. So what are the next steps here? We're at the Housing Research Collaborative. Well, first of all, I want to thank the sponsors of this, which are the Wall Center at UBC that funded the international roundtables where we solicited the ideas for the good practices. And also the Real Estate Foundation of BC for our ongoing support of the Housing Research Collaborative. So what are the next steps? We are looking now at another project that is called Filling the Gaps. What we want to know now is, what's missing from the housing responses. And so we're going to be probably asking maybe many of you to give us some ideas on this. We'd also like for you to be sending us initiatives you think are good and really addressing sort of the critical need right now. So please send it. They're on our website. There's a way that you can send us information. Please do, and we can update this database, which I think is going to be very useful. For what we've learned now from all of the examples is, I think, really important for Canada. Some of the good practices are in Canada, but others are really, from other places in Europe and Australia and also in the Global South. We are actually, we need to be learning in a global way how to do this. The only way housing is going to be addressed is as a global solution, and that's what we that's what we hope we show through this database. So now I want to really turn it to you to be asking questions, and already I see some questions in the database, and so please do send us some more. I'm going to be monitoring the database, and in the chat. So please do send us questions in the chat. And I'm going to start off with a couple that we received already even before the webinar. So I'm going to turn to Carolyn to ask, I'm going to ask her the first question. With several recent studies for highlighting the impact of municipal development processes, approvals, and charges and fees on housing construction and affordability, how can we ensure all orders of government are putting their respective levers to maximize investments in housing and therefore housing outcomes?
That's a really good question. And because there hasn't been federal leadership in Canada for 3 decades, it's been really, it's become a very, very fragmented housing system. So absolutely, in terms of the new policy that's a COVID response and comes out of advocacy by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, there is an expectation from the federal government that rapid housing will be built rapidly. There are a lot of local governments that are creating affordable housing agencies like Vancouver or concierges for affordable housing. I would totally agree that there needs to be that kind of attention built to expedite approvals of affordable housing. But some of the examples that Julie was giving were from local governments that have been given a lot more power and a lot more revenue sources than Canadian municipalities. And I think it's really important to stress that, for instance, maybe cities should be in charge of rent control and rent freezes. Maybe cities should be given the opportunity to borrow or use municipal bonds for affordable housing, as in the case of many other jurisdictions. So I think that there is both a lot of local power that can happen with more regulatory and fiscal means. And I also think that the federal government in Canada and the provincial and territorial governments need to have a chat about some mechanisms such as evictions and rent controls in order to prevent increasing homelessness.
Okay, thank you. So Julie, in some countries, government and private pension plans invest in affordable housing with return on investment. Do you see potential for this in Canada? Is this worth exploring?
It's definitely worth exploring. The key issue, of course, is the cost and the conditions associated with any form of capital investment. So care needs to be taken to compare that with what is now historically incredibly low public borrowing costs. So if you are running a program, or you have to weigh up, do I end up having to assist the demand side because the rents are higher, and do I have to provide, will they be less affordable, the dwellings, and who am I doing it for? Obviously, the greater the proportion of low cost and low condition, if you like, equity, the greater the proportion of that, the less reliance on more costly financing. And so if you are operating a scheme where the costs matter and they influence the rents, that's the key question. So the cost of capital, the conditions that it go with. Now, every pension fund has different buckets, different strategies associated with different portfolios of assets which they manage to create returns, of course, for their policyholders. Some of those portfolios are looking for long-term, low-risk investments. They're the kinds that we'd like to have investing in long-term, low-risk forms of housing. So we'd be looking at, for example, the fixed income bucket, which invests in bonds, and the longer the better. A very good example of how that works is the Swiss bond issuing cooperative, where it's like a buying group. It issues bonds, pension funds buy those bonds, and they have a government guarantee, and that issues very, very low cost financing for affordable housing providers. And that's been going now for about 15, 20 years. And that's the most cost-effective financial intermediary of any of them that I've looked at, certainly more cost-effective than the one I helped set up in Australia. And I still am in touch with the people who run that cooperative in Switzerland, and they tell me every year how well they're doing. And it is that was set up from nothing as a group of participants, and I've written about that, and happy to share. It's on the Honorary website. it's called Enhancing Finance, Financial Intermediaries and Guarantee Structures. Have a look at that, and it's fully described. If you like, the Swiss bond issuing cooperative.
Thank you. Isaac de Suster asked, how can we tackle and mitigate the stigmatization around social affordable housing in North America and move towards a model where this is more accepted, like in Europe or Southeast Asia? I mean, I think we're at that point because what happened for the last several decades since the 1990s is that we were only really building social housing for people who were at the most most disadvantaged end of the spectrum. There was or that were considered the most needy, most kind of acceptably needy. So there were the people in who were there were seniors, low-income single parents, and people with multiple barriers. What's happening is that the spectrum of who needs support in housing has really changed. And using an example of BC Housing in Vancouver, in British Columbia, they're now supporting a range from from people who are homeless by now sort of providing sort of shelters through repurposed hotels and motels, all the way to assisted home ownership, because they're recognizing that kind of spectrum is changing. And so I think along with that, I think really needs to be a rethinking of what is possible in government supported housing. So maybe the term social housing has become used for just one segment, and we need to be thinking about more around community housing, which is definitely how the nonprofit housing sector is thinking about it. So, and I'm going to now turn to Carolyn, who has a question from Emily Parody. Please explain the difference between limited profit and social nonprofit housing.
Right, so actually Julie might have something to say about this as well, but I think what you were talking about earlier, Penny, is the key issue, which is that we have to, as a society in Canada, but also as a globe, turn away from the notion of housing as a way to get rich, get wealth, invest for retirement, and start looking at housing as a way, as a need and as a right. So when Emily asks about limited profit, there's a lot of limited equity projects, for instance, Habitats for Humanity's homes where you can sell on your home, but the land underneath it, for instance, is kept. So there's a little bit of equity in that home, but there's also a sort of shared equity or a limited profit. Similarly, when we look in Germany, where rents are regulated in a way that's associated with the size, there's a limit on the profit that you can make on a land as a landlord. So really what we need to start moving beyond is this notion that property as a way to create a great deal of wealth doesn't have any social and environmental costs, because the social and environmental costs are huge. And we need to start thinking about ways that housing can be less about making a profit and more about making homes. I know that's a very abstract answer to a very specific question, but it's the point I want to make.
Okay. So how do cities convince, this is from Karen Darwoon, how do cities convince individual citizens to pay for housing migrants from other regions? Why should taxpayers of one municipality use their resources for housing the thousands of people migrating from other regions? Carolyn, do you want to take that on?
Well, I'd say that a place like Hamburg in Germany, which had, I believe in one year, like 40,000 asylum seekers due to Germany's very liberal policies on refugees, also has one of the better housing systems in Europe. They have this rule of thirds, which is they have voluntarily created an agreement between the local government, and probably Julie can correct me on this, and the local organization of developers. And as long as developers come up with a rule of thirds, a third being for sale or rent with no regulation, a third being rent regulated, and a third being social housing, those proposals will be expedited. Now, I'm not saying that Hamburg has zero homelessness issues, but they just treat people as people, whether they have formal citizenship or not, whether they're asylum seekers, they will be contributing to society eventually. So, you know, I think we need to decouple the question of refugees, which will only increase this century with all of climate change, et cetera, with the notion that you can provide adequate housing for everyone. Julie, do you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to build on the Hamburg idea, because they were quite successful in forming an alliance. And from their success led to the National Affordable Housing Alliance, which became a multi-level government and stakeholder grouping, which in realizing that there's only so much a Hamburg can do, that they need to have multi-level governance, they need to have more stakeholders involved for no other reason than income and allocation and fiscal, the imbalance between who taxes and who spends. So we're seeing now that alliance. You can find if you search for that you can find that they were incredibly successful in getting a change in the basic law of the nation, in getting the national government to step back in and invest and transfer appropriate money. So I'm all for local effort, but I'm more for combining effort, and because housing is very much a multi-level governance issue. No one level government can do well on its own. It has to work in partnership, whether it be participation through planning, transfer of long-term agreements over funding, or the sheer, public borrowing power of generations of taxpayers. Those things have to come together, but not lose sight of the local and the neighbourhood and people. Yeah.
Thank you. So in some countries, government and private pension funds invest in affordable housing with a return on investment. Do you see potential for this in Canada? Is this worth exploring?
Yeah, I think we sort of covered that a little bit. And my response was, it depends what type of investment's being made. If it's, say, for example, equity investment, or it's investment in debt, if you like. That's a key distinction. Either one will have different requirements, conditions. You'll see, of course, the cost of capital will influence the affordability of the outcomes, and it may also affect if those outcomes have to lose that obligation to be affordable over time, or even have to be sold to recap the obligations to the investors. So I think try before you buy, model the difference, and see what those implications mean for eligibility, affordability, and basically the cost of the project. So yeah. That's when I mentioned the Swiss one, you have to remember that the purchasers of those bonds are pension funds. It's just a different part of the pension fund that's looking for very long-term, low-cost returns, and that's what is buying also the NIFIC bonds, but what might buy social bonds. But equity investment's a different matter. So there'll be different requirements. Of course, there are things called, there are other sorts of funds. A real estate investment trust is something which has become facilitated and enabled across many countries of the world. In some countries, they're banned from being involved in the housing market. So, and there are reasons for that. I think the problem at the moment isn't money. It's actually the political will to ensure that it goes towards things that matter. And that's where we have to make the intervention. There's plenty of money around. The money is relatively cheap. You just have to make the rules around it, channel it into the right places and the right things. And that's what government can do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So a key conundrum, this is from David Crenna, a key conundrum of municipal empowerment is fragmentation or effort in wider urban regions. Practical thoughts on that? I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn.
Well, first of all, let me say it's really great to see what a wonderful bunch of wonks have showed up to this to this talk. So hi, David. Look, living as I have in Australia, and Julie comes from Australia, I have to say municipal governments in Canada look so good in comparison to municipal governments in Australia where things are so fragmented. Having said that, absolutely there needs to be better regional governance. It's not really, other than Vancouver, it's not really a function of Canadian government at the moment. So really, I think what we've been talking about today is a need for integrated strategy at the local, provincial, territorial, federal government, or it might be called state in other countries, et cetera, that are using the same definitions of affordable housing, talking the same language, doing the same kinds of needs assessments. I think that another question that Mark Guzlis asked is very relevant, which is until we start talking about household income categories, and particularly the needs of very low income households, we're going to continue subsidizing, in some cases, the wrong populations, or at least the populations that are most, not most at need. So really, every single government in Canada, and this is also true internationally for international listeners, can only benefit through national conversations on what's affordable housing, who is affordable housing for, where are we going to target our efforts, how are we going to measure success. Extraordinarily, in 2020, we're just starting to have those conversations. In Canada, the National Housing Strategy Act only dates from 2019. So we have to really engage in a national dialogue. As Mary said in the beginning, I think we are absolutely at a turning point in Canada. And as Julie was just talking about, I think there's a turning point in Europe. Hopefully there's a turning point internationally where we're starting to treat affordable housing seriously. And I'm not sure we are yet. And I know that we do need to do that.
So, okay, I just want to get one quick more question in. I don't know if will the newly announced federal government housing initiatives in Canada actually find its way to help the poor? Or can we assume it will largely direct to affordable housing for middle and lower income families and individuals?
Well, I was actually looking at Mark's question as I answered that. And maybe, Penny, you've been doing such a great job moderating. Maybe you'd like the last word in discussion.
Okay.
Okay.
So yes, I mean, there is a real, well, I mean, the fact that they've actually directed housing to funding to the, government, for provinces and municipalities to acquire motels, hotels, those are things, is a positive sign that they're hopefully going to be redirecting some of that money to the most low income. So I think we're almost out of time, and I really thank everybody. I thank the panelists, and I thank all of the people on this webinar for the great questions. And please do use the database. and also add to the database. We'd really like to hear from you about some ideas, initiatives that you think really need to be added. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
I'd just like to add my thanks to Michaela and Andreas, because sometimes we don't pay enough respect to people at the back end who are taking all of our wonk ideas and making them accessible. And both Michaela and Andreas took our work and made it easy for people to use. So thank you, Andrés, and thank you, Michaela, who isn't part of this panel.
Yeah, so thank you. So I hope you can actually also access this through the, tell other people to view the video. So thank you very much.